So as folks have said, many of us in this room today have known each other for decades, I will say. So a lot of this work that we've done together, I'll be showing you. I've done a couple of versions of this at this point, so it's definitely feeling more like many of us, closer to retirement than not. So this isn't totally my retirement show, but it starts to feel like that. And also just, all of the folks in the room, all the friendships, all of us that have worked together. This is our story. These are all things that we've worked on together and learned from each other, and we'll continue to do so and sort of passing it to the next generation as well. So we'll see if that hopefully helps. All right. So in terms of the next generation and or folks that might be not quite familiar with the Middle Rio Grande, I know most of us are, but I always like to start a little bit, not just 20 years ago, but way back when, sort of how did we get here, all these changes on the river. And those, of course, are anthropogenic changes. So this is just a little bit of an overview of how the river looked in yellow in 1918, and then how it has changed. This graphic is through 1989, due to the anthropogenic changes. So levees, dams, jetty jacks, all the things that we do to manage the water to help prevent flooding, those types of things. But also all those things collectively, how they change the hydrology, the geomorphology, and the existing vegetation. So here you can see I'm going to have some tables as we go along. Feel free to look at the numbers. I will point out certain things. Sometimes I won't. It's just to show you sort of a range of where we are in terms of flows on the river. So 1942 was our last biggest flood, flooded downtown Albuquerque. That's when they said, maybe we need a dam. So 72 is when we closed Cochiti, so you can see prior to that was the last time that we had 5-digit flow on the river, basically. Since then, these are high flows, peak flows, all the way up through 2021. So again, you can see that under 10,000 CFS average as we come into the post-Cochiti era. Again, that accumulation over time of all of those anthropogenic effects started to feed more into additional constraints on the system. We had population increase, folks moving into the valley along the river, the amount of water we have, drought, that additional disconnection of the floodplain as we have aggradation in reaches, climate variability, and also that disconnected floodplain with invasive species mixed in there and increased fire danger. Since we don't have that connection with the floodplain for flooding to take out that dead and down material, then fire became the next instance that did that, especially with non-native invasive species. So these are some of our fun friends here, and we all know the woody species that we work with, but I also added our fun friend Ravenna grass here. Many other, of course, weedy species, herbaceous species, but these are the main woody species that many of us work with. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the restoration work, and I threw up all these other terms. Even though I'm a restoration ecologist, that term restoration we know is used very loosely. We are not restoring to any particular point in time here. We are working within the system that we have, so we're really enhancing, preserving, doing rehabilitation work, but not true restoration. So the goals and techniques a lot of us have been using over the past 20 plus years. A number of things, of course, again, that dead and down material and exotic species, thinning that out to help both with fire prevention, but also just diversity within the habitat in general. Jetty jack removal. I don't have a picture of them here, but there are thousands of them within the river. Most of you have seen them look like jetty jacks from World War II. In the Albuquerque Reach, there are 30,000 jacks, and we've removed about 10,000 through the various projects. But there are probably close to 100,000 jetty jacks in the river system. Revegetation, the mosaic. We've all heard the mosaic mentioned this morning. This is a little bit of a graphic up top here. Oops, I did something. I hit the green. There. Okay, thank you. So I look at it in two ways. It's both a mosaic of understory, overstory, herbaceous, open water, grasses, as well as a mosaic of species. Native vegetation, we know we also always have some percentage of non-native vegetation mixed in. The goal as a restoration ecologist is to have predominantly native vegetation and work with the non-natives in the system. And then a lot of the focus of the projects I'm going to talk about are what I call bringing the bosque back to the river. We have that disconnected floodplain, especially in the Albuquerque Reach, but other reaches where you're standing on the bank of the river and you're 3 to 5 to 8 feet above the river. Obviously, you're not going to get overbank flooding there. So we implement these features to make that connection. High flow channels we talked about a little bit this morning. I'm going to get into those in a little more detail. Backwater channels, which really as a high water channel, either end of your high water channel is a backwater channel and is going to get your initial connection. Bank terracing, willow swales, you can see some in this photo here, and I'm going to show you some other examples. Wetland restoration in general, again combined in many areas with recreation. But the main goal is floodplain connection. So you're going to see that term throughout here. I made it bigger and bold, floodplain connection, but with my caveat, within the current constraints of the system, right? What can we do between the levees right now? So a lot of the rest of my talk I call hydrologic notes from an ecologist, because you can't do ecological restoration without water, right? So again, you'll see some of my graphs, but this is just an overview, sort of my view of just sort of lumping in groupings of the past 20 years. So 2000 to 2010, our roughly average annual flow, every other flow, was 3770 CFS. This is when we were starting to both build projects and design additional projects. Post-Cochiti, our highest release flow was 6,000 to 7,000 CFS. Constrained because of the railroad bridge. Now, I think as Paul mentioned, we're more like 4,500 CFS with other constraints in the Blend Reach. So we're constrained about how much we can release. Post-Cochiti, in more the 2010 to 2015 range, our average annual flow dropped to maybe 2,000, 2,500 CFS. And this is when we're really starting to put some projects on the ground. Our last highest peak flow was in 2005, 6780. We had a good run last year at 5080 at Central, but ran also for a long time. This is a reminder to myself as well, don't forget about duration. Just when you're planning projects, you're looking at flow, what the site's potential is, and in terms of duration, that helps you with planning vegetation. Sometimes our duration is only a week. Last year it was a month or more, right? So sometimes you don't know, but you have to think about that. So one of the first projects that we started with was the Albuquerque Overbank project in 1998. How many folks were here in 1998? Yay, there's all my friends. I call it, we're in the further into the 50s, right? All good, it's all good. So this was the first, again, floodplain connection type project. This is a brainchild of Dr. Crawford, who was a mentor to many of us. Many of us worked together on this project, reclamation, MRG-CD, open space, heritage program. SD is here, going to talk after me today. And he was looking at this sort of attached bar and how do we get that reconnected? And this is what it looked like afterwards. This was where we just basically opened up this channel here, water flowed through, and you get some reconnection here. I would say, and I added this just as we were talking about ecosystem focus, I would say that was with an ecosystem focus that Dr. Crawford was thinking of that. Just reconnection with the floodplain, let the bosque do its thing, and let those critters that are there be a part of that. Collaborative program, we are here today, 21 years, I would say roughly, and then as many of us have said, even before that, we were working together, Bosque Initiative and other programs. So a long time, initially focused, of course, on the main 2 species, and other species have been added. So one of the first projects that the collaborative program did was the Los Lunas Habitat Restoration Project. It was a fire that occurred in 2000, took advantage of that site to do some work. And again, I would say it was focused on floodplain connection. We were talking about minnow and flycatcher, but as a program, I would say don't sell ourselves short. We were looking at ecosystem function even back when we were doing those projects, because there's no sign at these sites that says minnow and flycatcher only. Everybody else stay out, right? All the birds, all the fish, all the critters are going to use it. Yes, some of the focus may create certain types of habitat, but especially if a project like this, we did a lot of variable habitat. We did some of those terraces, we did some high flow channels, we did some backwaters, and there was annual monitoring that went with that. So we were continually monitoring what's going on. You will see we had some pretty low flows within that time frame, especially the first 2 years. It probably got barely inundated. but had some higher flows after that, and it has inundated a number of years since it was constructed. The next one through the collaborative program was the Nature Center Habitat Project that Hira mentioned. This was one of my first projects when I went to the Corps from open space. And you can see the remnant channel here had been disconnected as the floodplain accreted within the river. So we were looking at reconnecting the channel for minnow. It's pretty far off the main stem, as you see this here. Again, same concept, embayment openings that are wide and inundate at lower flows on either end, so you're getting sort of a backwater until there's enough flow to push through. We finished construction in 2008, right as the 5400 flow was hitting, so it definitely did flow that year, but not every year since then. And this is one thing I'll show that you can see the inlet started to get filled in. In terms of adaptive management, so we did come back in and reopen the inlet that was getting accreted 6 years later. I don't think that's too bad in terms of if you're trying to maintain that high flow connection. I will say, and I'll try to remember to mention in the rest of the talk here, high flow channels, especially this far away from the main stem, I wouldn't necessarily recommend, and I think a lot of us came to those conclusions as we did more and more. You want things closer to the edge of the river, on the edge of the floodplain. I'd call them more low-hanging fruit, where you can get connections and maybe even various types of connections, and I'll show you examples of some of those. So again, we're talking about lessons learned, things we want to carry forward. Many of us in this room are working on these projects during this time frame and coordinating and sharing lessons learned on the ground, taking those forward. So again, those high flow channels, it's going to be really hard to design for, hitting peak flows at what durations, and probably not even every 3 to 5 or more years at this point in time. So you have to be very cognizant of where the flows continue dropping, if your reach is grading or degrading, and what else is going on in that area. Variable habitat, so again, looking at not just a high flow channel or just a willow swale, but combining as many types of features as you can to get as much variability as possible. Again, tied into that mosaic. Looking at floodplain connection gain, I call it. So if you're excavating for a terrace or whatever portion, get that sediment off-site. Otherwise, you haven't gained within the floodplain in terms of making that surface connection. Maybe it can go to the levee or elsewhere, but not having a berm so that as you get water coming in, it can just directly flow over and into the bosque. Maintenance of native vegetation, and of course, invasive species management is ongoing for all of us for life, right? So the next project we worked on was the Ecosystem Restoration at Route 66 project, north and south of Central on both sides of the river. So we completed the project in 2010. Did all of the things we've been doing. It was one of the first ones where we also really looked more, especially in the Albuquerque Reach, at floodplain connection along the bank. So we didn't remove any jacks yet, but we had high flow channels, backwater channels, that again would allow water to come into the floodplain, and wanted to test from a safety perspective to make sure there wouldn't be an issue with the levees. So this is just some photos. Here we have a weir around a recreation structure, but on the right you can see we opened in 2010. Again, somehow we always hit, oh, we finished just before high flow, and we actually get a high flow, which is cool. So then you're enacted right away. This is one of the high flow channels, but it also spread out all the way through the bosque to the toe of the levee. So again, we could see, well, it was really just sort of meandering over there slowly. It wasn't any rush at the toe of the levee. Okay, we think we can do more of these floodplain connection type projects then. So then some additional collaborative program projects. We had a big rush for a 5-year period or so, where there was a lot of funding that we were getting through reclamation. A lot of agencies were doing projects on the ground. So you can see just in the Albuquerque Reach, this is I-40 Central, all these little orange hash marks are areas where projects were done by Reclamation, Interstate Stream Commission, MRG, all the folks within the program. And again, just further testing those floodplain connection features, what's working and what works together. So all of those lessons learned cumulatively over that 15 years or so were then taken forward into what we call the Grande Restoration Project that was implemented by the Corps of Engineers. And I'll note it was 2011 to 2017. So again, it was coordination with other projects. This is a little bit more zoomed in to another reach of the river. I think this is Rio Bravo. These were collaborative program projects that had been implemented prior, most of them by ISC, that we then looked at, well, where can we connect and make some other features, more connections to allow further floodplain connection. And this is where I also want to note, especially where we are now with the continually decreasing flows and potentially where we are in drought, potentially where you are in your system. Look at what you have in terms of low-hanging fruit. What's along the edge of the floodplain? Maybe you have to do a long, skinny type habitat rather than a wide habitat. You still want to be looking at what your goals are, if there's a certain amount of acreage, if you're looking for avian species or fish species. It depends on what your goal is, but just in terms of if you can stay within that 300 foot of the river corridor, also for water rights, but also for just that connectivity. The further away from that you get, it's going to be harder to connect those areas. So again, this project was 6 years, so also in terms of talking about phasing. So another thing to look at within your projects is, especially if you're able to, phase it both in terms of implementation, especially if you're swapping out maybe salt cedar habitat for more native habitat. You want to do it in smaller chunks so that, especially if it's being utilized by flycatcher or other bird species, that they still have habitat in between, rather than, you know, wiping out 500 acres all at once and then they're left with nothing. So this project was phased over 6 years. It was 900 acres, but it was bits and pieces at a time to try to look at that phasing. Also just in terms of not having to have that much of an impact in one reach of the river all at once. So in phase one, we worked with the sponsors, Conservancy District, the Pueblo of Sandia, Open Space, also Village of Corrales, Reclamation, and I think that's everybody. And we actually have more than 5 years of monitoring, which I'm going to talk about. But again, a number of locations up and down the river, from starting in 2011 through 14, where we had, you know, we had a high flow here. I don't know that we hit that for the Route 66 project, but here's where we're implementing this project, which is still decent flows, 2,500 and above. You're going to get some connection, because for the most part, these sites were designed for that level of connection at that point in time, 2,500 CFS or less. So here's an example of a site. This is up in Corrales on the west side of the river. You can see this is looking downstream. This is a swale with a terrace in front of it. So the terrace gets enacted and then the water spills over into the willow swale. So you get a large area of inundation, decent flow at the time. This is an example of the design for south of Rio Bravo on the east side. You can see these areas here, and in between them was actually already a little high flow channel that ISC had constructed. So we connected features to it so that all that would inundate. So you can see that feature there, and then we went in on this side of it with a willow swale, this side of it with a willow swale and a terrace. So that makes all of that connected and acted, and that's what it looks like on the ground. I just wanted to show this one real quick. At the south diversion channel is here, and we have a high flow channel, and you can see all the swale habitat here that was constructed. And then talking about the SWRP project that's coming in. And again, we were looking at 2,500 CFS here. Yes, the inlet here is filled in with sediment. So the SWRP project, and if I can get the acronym correct, hopefully, is now looking at 1,500 CFS, right? Because now that's more of a typical, potentially average annual, every other year flow. So phase 2 design focused on a number of sites, including the San Antonio Oxbow, which I'll show real quick. So on the west side of the river, we have about 54-acre wetland. And here's a little bit of the design features, and here it was after implementation. I'm going to look at these last few slides real quick. This is a site in Corrales. I just want to show you, this was after excavation. This was actually the site where design showed we had to excavate a certain amount. By the time we got out on site, that portion of the river had degraded, so we actually had to excavate quite a bit more. So in terms of if you're designing a site right now for something you might implement in the fall, if I were to pick that site today, I would move to a different site because you have to excavate a lot further. So if you have the ability to do that, that's what I wanted to show there. Monitoring. Lots of monitoring that was done through all of these projects, both through the Corps, through the collaborative program. ISC did a lot of monitoring on all of their projects. So again, we are continually learning from each other and feeding each other that information, and that's all out there on the collaborative program website to take forward. And then just a few closing remarks on thinking about operations and maintenance and/or adaptive management. A couple notes I'll say is that I think of, we want to make these projects sustainable, but I would think of them as sustainable while successional. So yes, we might have done a high flow channel here or a backwater here. That doesn't mean it has to stay that. It's going to turn into the next thing, the next type of mosaic. It might go from a open water to more of a marsh wetland. It might go from a marsh wetland to a grassland. It might go from a grassland to an upland, as we talked about, and that's okay. Or to a mid canopy, or to an upper canopy. So it's continually cycling through. So I would just think about that in terms of when you think you might need to do an O&M or adaptive management, that maybe it still fits in the mosaic. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe I can do limited O&M or adaptive management. Any questions? I think I'm on my last one. Yes, Kira.
Not to put you too much on the spot, but what do you think is the greatest success of all of these efforts? Is it just how many acres of riparian vegetation has been created, or has there been something else sort of quantified in terms of how much habitat has been created for flycatchers or cuckoos or soaring minnows?
Here asked about what the greatest success of all this would have been. I will push the point again that while some of these projects were focused on minnow and or flycatcher, it still created habitat for everything. And the Midway Grand Restoration Project especially was ecosystem focused. It wasn't species focused. And so we really focused on that floodplain connection and the mosaic of habitat types for everything. Yes, we did do flycatcher surveys. We have a lot of use at those sites. We even have nesting at some of those sites since that time, which we have never had in the Albuquerque Reach, which is pretty cool. But I think just the ecosystem approach in general, we have a number of little studies that students have done, consultants have done, all the bits and pieces that we have learned and we all take forward. And all of you know me, I'm a very optimistic person, so I'm trying not to be gloom and doom about low flows. There's still a lot we can do, like Paul said. There's still a lot we can do. And I would say the other success is this here. Everything we've done together, learn from each other, continue to pass on to the next generation. That's a big success story to me, is everything we've done together.